A man stalked Jacqueline Kennedy for years. He followed her children through Central Park. He dated her husband's housekeeper to extract her daily schedule. He called her game, a word that belongs to hunting, that reduces a woman to something you track through the woods and mount on a wall. When Jackie finally dragged him into a courtroom in 1972, the first time in American legal history that a court enjoined a photographer from photographing a specific human being, his lawyer told him to bill her for the legal fees. She never paid. She never answered. The silence she offered that invoice was the most eloquent communication she ever directed at him. His name was Ron Galella, and a documentary about Jackie Kennedy's life sat this same man in a chair, gave him good lighting, and let him smile into the camera. "I was obsessed with her," he said. "Obsessed because I had no girlfriend. I wasn't married." Meanwhile, a commentator on the same film described JFK's serial cheating as straightforward, a word that launders decades of institutional betrayal into something resembling candor. The single most liked response from the documentary's own audience, at over 1,000 points of engagement, cut through every frame the filmmakers had assembled. "I have never understood the worship of the Kennedys." A film that claimed to honor Jackie Kennedy committed the same sin as every man who passed through her life. It used her story while erasing her. The most photographed woman in America was never actually seen. Satisfied viewers who enjoyed the documentary's framing almost certainly didn't comment. Silence registers differently than approval. What follows serves the vocal, frustrated majority. The audience, whose comments formed coherent clusters of outrage, so unified that 6 separate friction scores landed above 0.95. On YouTube, where commenting viewers drive algorithmic signals, that majority defines the conversation. The broader viewing audience may feel less uniformly outraged, but the evidence presented here is drawn from what was said, measured, and documented. And what it reveals is damning enough. Galella's campaign against Jackie began in the mid-1960s and persisted with the mechanical regularity of obsession for nearly 2 decades. He materialized on sidewalks outside her Fifth Avenue apartment building. He appeared at restaurants where she was dining. He trailed Caroline and John Jr., children, minors, a girl and a boy who had already watched their father's coffin carried through Washington, to their schools, through parks, along the ordinary routes of their daily lives, until his presence became an ambient threat, woven into the architecture of their childhood. A man with a camera, always pressing closer, always needing one more frame. When physical proximity failed to yield the reaction shots he needed, he escalated. He initiated a romantic relationship with Aristotle Onassis' housekeeper for the specific purpose of obtaining Jackie's whereabouts. He pursued a woman, performed intimacy with her, extracted her employer's daily schedule, and used it to position himself in Jackie's path. That chain of manipulation demolishes any claim to spontaneous artistry before the claim can even form. Galella didn't stumble onto Jackie at the right moment. He engineered the encounters with operational discipline, staking out locations, and treating a grieving widow's movements through Manhattan as intelligence to be gathered and exploited. His physical aggression provoked physical responses. In Central Park, Galella's proximity became so threatening that Jackie directed a Secret Service agent to smash his camera. A woman, surrounded by federal agents, reduced to ordering the destruction of equipment because no legal mechanism existed to make this man retreat. After another confrontation, having deliberately enraged her to capture her distress on film, Galella threw a parting line in her face. "Yes, thank you. Goodbye." He had gotten what he came for, a photograph of a woman's anger which he could sell. The politeness of the farewell was the cruelest part. Civility stretched over an act of calculated provocation designed to produce exactly the emotional response he then monetized. Referring to someone as game is disturbing in itself, wrote one viewer of the documentary. The word places Jackie inside the lexicon of predation. She becomes something pursued across terrain, tracked by scent and habit, captured for display. When the filmmakers gave Galella a platform to deliver his smiling confession about obsession and loneliness, they framed pathology as personality. A man's admitted fixation on a traumatized widow became the charming eccentricity of a storied career. The audience explicitly rejected this framing. They demanded, with measurable unanimity, that commentators stop calling Galella a photographer. The word they wanted was the one the legal system eventually applied. In 1972, the case landed before Judge Irving Ben Cooper in the Southern District of New York. The trial established a precedent that had never before been necessary: a court formally ordering a man with a camera to maintain physical distance from another human being. The original restraining order mandated 50 yards between Galella and Jackie, with greater buffers around her children. Galella's response bypassed the evidence, the testimony, and the documented pattern of harassment entirely. He claimed the judge had been appointed by President Kennedy, recasting the verdict as political persecution rather than the legal consequence of years of stalking. He said nothing about the behavior itself. The conspiracy claim carried the confidence of a man who has never been required to examine his own conduct, a reflexive pivot to grievance that left the actual record of his actions completely unaddressed. The restraining order didn't stop him. Galella violated it repeatedly throughout the 1970s, photographing Jackie at distances far closer than the court had mandated, routing around the legal barrier the way he had routed around locked doors and security details for years. By 1982, Jackie was back in court seeking contempt charges, and this time, the proceedings introduced a consequence that penetrated where paper orders had failed: a cell, a locked door, the loss of physical freedom. Galella agreed to never photograph Jackie Kennedy again, an agreement born entirely from self-preservation. He had absorbed fines, violated orders, recast judicial rulings as conspiracies, and continued hunting his game through every obstacle the legal system placed in his path. Only the prospect of a cage produced compliance. That is a documented legal fact. Galella died in 2022. His obituaries called him the godfather of the U.S. paparazzi. The documentary let him narrate Jackie's story from a comfortable chair. He spent decades selling photographs of a traumatized widow and her fatherless children, and the last institution to handle his legacy handed him a microphone and soft focus. The Kennedy fortune originated with Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a man whose resume reads like a catalog of American corruption. Stock market manipulation before the Securities and Exchange Commission existed to prevent it. Hollywood deal-making that leveraged financial power into sexual access. His affair with actress Gloria Swanson was conducted so openly that he brought her on a transatlantic voyage while his wife Rose occupied the adjacent cabin. And the persistent, historically documented allegations of bootlegging during Prohibition, which an audience member distilled into 6 words that generated 66 points of engagement. You mean the rich bootlegging family. Joseph Kennedy allegedly offered Jackie $1 million to stay with Jack, a detail that reveals the family's operating logic with uncomfortable clarity. A woman's endurance of her husband's betrayals was a service that could be compensated at a negotiated rate. JFK's serial infidelities during his presidency were known to reporters, Secret Service agents, and White House staff. Marilyn Monroe. Judith Campbell Exner, who was simultaneously involved with Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana, turning personal betrayal into a national security liability. Various White House staffers. A rotating cast of women facilitated into and out of the executive mansion with logistical precision. Reporters who covered the White House knew and they wrote nothing. The Secret Service, charged with protecting the president's life, also protected his access to women who weren't his wife. The Kennedy family, led by a patriarch who had modeled exactly this behavior with Gloria Swanson and others, treated it as the natural order of things. The documentary's commentator described this systematic institutional betrayal with one word: straightforward. The audience heard that word for what it was: a laundering of decades of complicity into something that sounds almost honest, almost simple, when what it actually describes is a man who cheated on his wife compulsively while every institution surrounding them enabled it. Elected to office, not anointed king, wrote another viewer, at 557 points of engagement. These are the dominant voices from the documentary's own viewership. They describe an audience that has already done the work of demythologization and is frustrated that a new production is cycling through reverence they abandoned years ago. The filmmakers made a documentary for an audience that no longer exists, the audience that still genuflects at the Kennedy altar, the audience that actually showed up, delivered a verdict the film itself refused to reach. The pattern of men humiliating women while institutions looked away didn't start with JFK. Jackie learned it at home. A photograph of her father, John Vernu Bouvier III, Wall Street stockbroker, serial philanderer, the man everyone called Blackjack, shows him holding his girlfriend's hand while his wife Janet Lee Bouvier sat right next to them. The image contains no ambiguity. There is no angle from which it appears innocent. A man holds another woman's hand in the physical presence of his wife, and the gesture communicates that her knowledge of his infidelity is irrelevant to his behavior. Janet divorced him in 1940. Jackie was 11. She had already internalized the lesson that would define her relationship to men for the rest of her life. They will do what they want, in front of you, and the world will look away. Biographers describe her bond with her father as electric, conspiratorial, fierce, and that adoration coexisted with the knowledge that he was fundamentally incapable of honoring the women in his life. She carried both truths simultaneously, the way children of unfaithful parents always do. The innocent America the documentary invoked when framing the Kennedy era exists exclusively in the memories of people for whom America was designed to be comfortable. That absolutely depends on who you were in America, wrote one viewer, generating 235 points of engagement. The concept of innocence depended entirely on which America you inhabited. For Black Americans, whose communities were being bombed and burned by racists, that innocence never existed. The Kennedy era, 1961 through 1963, coincided with the assassination of Medgar Evers in his own driveway in Jackson, Mississippi. 4 girls died in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair. Freedom riders were beaten bloody in bus stations across the South. Fire hoses were turned on children in Birmingham. JFK's own administration authorized the FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. To drape this era in nostalgia is to erase the experience of every American for whom the early 1960s were defined by terror, exclusion, and state-sanctioned violence. The audience understood this instinctively. A narrator earns trust by refusing to repeat the documentary's selective blindness. What the filmmakers should have examined, and what their own audience was sophisticated enough to appreciate, is the survival intelligence that carried Jackie through a life designed by other people's ambitions and failures. Trained to marry money, wrote a viewer whose comment generated the 5th highest engagement in the entire audit, at 353 points. Her image was polished for that task. She was far more calculating and manipulative than most people want to admit. That comment contains a truth that hagiography can't accommodate and tabloid gossip can't respect. Jackie's mother, Janet Lee Auchincloss, having survived her own marriage to a faithless husband, and extricated herself through a strategic remarriage to Hugh D. Auchincloss, a man of genuine, stable wealth, prepared her eldest daughter with methodical precision for the same maneuver. Jackie was sent to Miss Porter's school, then to Vassar College, where she developed the intellectual foundations that would distinguish her from every other political wife of her generation. A transformative year at the Sorbonne in Paris followed. She finished her degree at George Washington University, emerging fluent in French, deeply knowledgeable about art and architecture, possessed of an intellectual sophistication that most of her critics would spend decades underestimating. Before she married JFK, Jackie worked as the inquiring camera girl at the Washington Times-Herald. The job sounds whimsical. It wasn't. She roamed the Capitol with a camera and a notepad, approaching strangers cold and asking them questions that required charm, nerve, and the ability to make people reveal themselves in 30 seconds. Jackie produced the column while navigating the social world of 1950s Washington, with one eye already on the strategic alliances her mother had trained her to build. The irony of her later torment by Galella carries a specific weight. The woman he stalked with a camera had once been herself a young woman with a camera, working the streets of the Capitol with professional discipline and genuine curiosity. She understood the tool. She understood what it meant to point it at someone. The difference was consent. Her strategic intelligence was forged in specific conditions, watching her father's infidelities, absorbing her mother's response, understanding from childhood that a woman's security depended on the alliances she built and the image she projected. To frame this as a character flaw is to misunderstand the conditions that produced it. To ignore it entirely, the way hagiography does, is to strip Jackie of the agency that defined her. She married John F. Kennedy in September 1953 in Newport, Rhode Island. Both parties understood the terms. Jack needed a wife who could perform the role of political spouse with grace and photogenic elegance. Jackie needed financial security her own fractured family could no longer guarantee. She entered this arrangement with her eyes open, aware of the Kennedy men's reputations, aware of her own father's precedent, aware of precisely what she was walking into. That awareness is evidence of intelligence, not naivete. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, Jackie sat inches from her husband in the back of a Lincoln Continental convertible when a bullet destroyed his skull. She was wearing a pink Chanel suit. Blood and brain matter covered her clothing, her hands, her lap. She crawled across the trunk of the moving limousine, a reflex analyzed by 1,000 commentators who were nowhere near that car. In the hours that followed, aides urged her to change. She refused. "I want them to see what they have done to Jack," she reportedly said. That sentence contains more political intelligence and rhetorical devastation than most professional communicators achieve in a lifetime. She stood beside Lyndon Johnson on Air Force One as he took the oath of office, still wearing the suit, her face held in a composure that concealed something the public would only learn later. Jackie became depressed, suicidal. The full psychological aftermath of watching her husband's head come apart at close range while sitting in his blood manifested in a grief so total that its contours are difficult to reconstruct from the outside. She was 34 years old. She had 2 children who needed a mother capable of functioning, and the nation expected her to embody dignified mourning while privately confronting the question of whether she wanted to continue living at all. A viewer of the documentary described her own experience of that November day. "Rocking my firstborn baby son, who was 2 weeks old, watching TV, and saw JFK shot and his head explode, blood everywhere, and Jackie terrified." That was the collective American trauma experienced through a television screen. And Jackie was at its epicenter, physically covered in its evidence, expected to perform composure for a nation that wouldn't grant her the privacy to fall apart. She planned the funeral herself, modeled on Abraham Lincoln's, with the riderless horse and the eternal flame at Arlington National Cemetery. She did all of this while in the grip of a trauma that would shadow the rest of her life. Jackie married Aristotle Onassis in 1968 for financial security, physical distance from America, and protection from the press and public that treated her grief as content. The public backlash was enormous. The devastating loss of Onassis's son Alexander in a 1973 plane crash shadowed the marriage. After Aristotle Onassis's death in 1975, Jackie returned to New York, where she built the life the documentary should have spent its runtime examining. She walked into the offices of Viking Press as a book editor, entering the workforce at a level that required her to prove she belonged there. Publishing insiders expected a vanity hire, a famous name on the masthead who would attend cocktail parties and acquire nothing of substance. Jackie proved them wrong with the specificity of her editorial instincts. She read manuscripts, corresponded with authors, attended editorial meetings, and brought to Viking a sensibility shaped by her years in the arts and her deep knowledge of art and architecture. She moved from Viking to Doubleday, and across nearly 2 decades as an editor, built a catalog that reflected the range of her intellectual life. Books on art, architecture, ballet, history, photography, the full range of subjects that had engaged her mind since the Sorbonne. She wasn't performing the role of editor. She was doing the job, showing up at the office. And she saved Grand Central Terminal. In the 1970s, the Penn Central Transportation Company planned to build a massive commercial skyscraper on top of one of the most architecturally significant buildings in the United States. Grand Central's soaring Beaux-Arts main concourse, its vaulted celestial ceiling, the entire structure, all of it slated for partial demolition or disfigurement to accommodate commercial development. Jackie threw herself into the preservation campaign with the same strategic precision she had applied to everything else in her life. She wielded her celebrity as a tactical instrument, deploying her social connections, galvanizing public opposition, and channeling her genuine passion for architecture and history into a fight that would reach the Supreme Court. The fight lasted years. Penn Central challenged New York City's landmarks law all the way to the Supreme Court. The resulting decision, Penn Central Transportation Company versus New York City, 1978, became one of the most important landmark preservation rulings in American legal history. Grand Central still stands. She did that. The documentary chose to give that screen time to Ron Galella instead. A viewer called the omission a fantastical shame. The description is precise. A film about Jackie Kennedy's life allocated minutes to a man who stalked her and 0 minutes to the building she saved, the books she edited, the preservation battles she won. And in doing so, committed the exact sin it should have been documenting. Every institution that touched Jackie Kennedy's life used her image for its own purposes. Her father paraded her through society while holding another woman's hand in his wife's presence. The Kennedy political machine deployed her fluency and poise as campaign assets. The tabloid industry sold her grief at newsstands across the country. Galella built a career on her face and confessed his obsession with a smile. The documentary continued the pattern with professional lighting and a distribution deal, giving airtime to her tormentor while omitting the Supreme Court case she helped win, the books she spent nearly 2 decades editing, and the buildings she fought to protect. Grand Central Terminal stands in Midtown Manhattan because Jackie Kennedy made it her fight. Her editorial work shaped American publishing for nearly 2 decades. She raised 2 children through assassination, stalking, and the relentless machinery of public consumption. And both grew into adults who understood what their mother had survived. The camera should have been pointed at all of that. Instead, the filmmakers did what every man in Jackie's life had already done. They pointed it at themselves. Subscribe for more stories like this.